Afternoon, Tim. How you doing?
Hello, Shabbar. I'm good. Yeah. How are you?
Yeah, very well, very well. Looking forward to having a chat with you today. And something that's just always puzzled me, caused me anxiety in my own life, but in the life of many of my clients is this, problem of money. It just creeps up everywhere. So since we're starting out, talking about money, what is the problem of money that we all seem to share in and face on a daily basis?
Yeah, great. All right. So let's focus on that for today. The problem of money. First thing is, I think the phrase comes from a lovely book. I'm going to read a quote in a minute from a guy called Jacob Needleman, who's I think like a philosophy professor in America, and he wrote a really good book called Money and the Meaning of Life. And why don't I read the quote? One of the things he says is, the problem of money dogs our steps throughout the whole of our lives, exerting a pressure that in its way is as powerful and insistent as any other problem of human existence. And it haunts the spiritual search as well. And then he goes on to say, without a long work on oneself, i.e. like one's own development, one's own inner exploration, it's impossible in contemporary conditions to be generous and free in regard to the force of money.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's weighty.
It's weighty. It's weighty. So if I just break that down a little bit, because you're questioning the problem of money. So he talks about the problem of money dogging our steps through the whole of our lives. It's as powerful as any other problem, of human existence. You can't even get away from it if you think you're off on a spiritual search. He says, the problem haunts even spiritual search. And then later on, he talks about the force of money. And how could we be generous and free with this force of money? So I really like that. So that the first thing is, notice he's not saying the problem with money, right? He's saying the problem of money.
Okay, let's just unpack the difference.
Yeah. Well, if I say the problem with money, I'm saying there's this thing called money, and money is a problem. It's like I'm making the problem is money. And then if I'm not careful, and I think a lot of people do, especially maybe more, I don't know, radical, countercultural, progressive, they go, money's bad, money's the source of all problems, capitalism, money. So then you put all the problem onto money and you kind of think, oh, if only we didn't have money, everything would be fine. He's not saying the problem with money, he's saying the problem of money. So what I think he's saying is, look, money is there. Money is everywhere, right? You can't really, whatever you do in life, you're dealing with money in some form. You've got to buy stuff, you get money in, you get taxes, all of this stuff. He's not saying there's a problem with it, but somehow it presents a problem to us. It feels like a problem for most people. So I think he's saying there's a problem of money, but it's not necessarily money's fault. He's not saying it's a problem with money.
Yeah.
And the one thing I'd add to that, and then back to you, and we'll see where we go, is the other thing in my experience, it would be very easy for maybe many people listening to this to think, oh yeah, well, money is a problem if you don't have it. But if you have it, or if you have enough of it, or if you're super rich, then money's not a problem, right? So then we'd say, well, no, the problem really is not having money. Well, what I can say, and I'm sure you've got examples from your work, it's not even as simple as that, because I've had many people come on, my workshops or the stuff I do around money who do have money, but there still feels like there's a problem of money. And for them, having all that money then becomes a problem in different ways to them. So yeah, we can unpack it and see where it takes us. But the idea, I think what Needleman is saying is, look, money is everywhere. It's a kind of fact of modern existence. And somehow it haunts us. It feels like a problem. It feels like a force or something quite strong. And most of us, whether we've got money or not, don't know how to really feel generous and free in our lives in relation to this. Yeah. So that's why I love those quotes. What do you think?
Well, it's making me smile when you say generous and free, because when I think about money, and just to circle back, I think when I was first starting, before I met you, when I was sort of doing some like money investigative work by just reading stuff about money and there was always this like write a letter to money. Like they, you know, it was like, and I remember writing this sort of letter to money, and it was really like a sort of, I've got a love-hate relationship. Like I love you, but I hate you at the same time. And I remember one of the feelings were that it just does bring up feelings of constraint. And there is this, you know, when you said, you know, feeling free, what was the quote in the, it was
yeah, he says without a long work on oneself, and that's interesting, right? We might get into what is that long work on maybe another podcast. Without a long work on oneself, it's impossible in contemporary conditions to be generous and free in regard to the force of money.
And literally, that is that feeling of constraint and that feeling of being shackled. And I think I've used that word several times when we've spoken before. But it's so true, and I can't be alone in feeling that way. And so what is going on? Because there's not a problem with money, and I think we can establish that, because I've got clients, you've got clients, and even if I just looked at family and friends, there are people with money and they still having issues. But is it just is it the human condition that keeps bumping up against this thing called money? What's going on, in your opinion, in this area?
That's a great question. That would take us quite deep. So what I wonder is if we maybe first just unpack a little bit some examples of the problem of money. Because when you ask what's going on, you know, that's great, but that we go quite deep. So, you know, maybe let's think together. So what would be examples for you of people who do have money, clients or people, you know, who seem to have money, right? The zeros add up, or they look at their bank statement and it's a big number, whatever that means, but somehow it still feels like a problem. So for you, you said it feels like a constraint. Can you think of any? I can think of one example maybe while you're thinking of yours. You know, I had a workshop where I was doing deep money work with a group of very, very successful business founders or chief executives. That's not the group I mainly work with, but on this occasion, they invited me to come to one of their retreats, actually because they were a group of, you know, powerful, successful men who'd been doing development work for 10 years with each other and acknowledged they still didn't know how to talk with each other about money. And they'd never talked about how much money each of them had. Like they were all pretty wealthy, but some were more wealthy than others. That whole topic, they just... So there's a problem of money right there. You have, maybe it wasn't 10, maybe 8 guys, right? They've been working deeply, intimately, in confidence, supporting each other with their personal, professional journey. They've been through businesses succeeding, failing, marriages, forming, affairs, failing, everything. And yet they'd still never talked about how much money each of them had. And they were aware that they found that really hard to talk about, and that sort of sitting there was going to be something really quite tricky for that group. So I would say one thing, that's not being free and generous with each other. That's a constraint.
Just sort of interrupt there, and just because you mentioned that example, what is the taboo around sort of talking about the amount of money that you earn? Or
well, it's a good question. So I'm going to write these things down because they're all important. And I think for today, we're going to talk around the problem, just notice the problem. So one is, it feels like a taboo, right? People don't talk about it. And as I say, these people had shared very intimate details about their marriages, their relationships, their ups and downs, and they still didn't want to put a number. So that's quite a force, right? That's quite a powerful. Let's stay there, but I'm still going to give this example of
go for it.
But what do you think is going on with the taboo, with these group of powerful men, and they're still not comfortable talking about numbers, like their numbers? What do you think?
So I'm going to just say that for me, it feels like a self-worth piece. The number, how much you earn, what your net worth is somehow conflated with how good you are. This is just my hypothesis. I've not checked it out with anyone, but I've maybe just my own experience. When I look at people that are wealthier, etc., I believe in some way that they are better, they are superior. And so I think there might be some shame around a figure, but I'm not so convinced around that, because even people, I don't know, even people with quite a lot of wealth and high earners don't go, don't, like you said, that they all earn very well, but there is obviously something there that's stopping them talking about that. I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's the done thing, really, to sort of, that are people worried that it will come across arrogant, maybe, that, oh, if you talk about how much you earn? I'm not sure, maybe a bit of all of those.
Probably a bit of all of those. I'd say all of the above and more. So just some things to notice again, just for today. That's really interesting, isn't it? Because we're talking about a number. What we're doing is sharing a number.
Yeah.
We're sharing a number that, if I look on my computer screen and it says you've got this much or this many zeros and you've got this many zeros, and, numbers are quite neutral, rational things. And yet, as you rightly say, somehow that number for many people ties into stuff. Might be about their feeling of self-worth, shame, embarrassment. They might perceive themselves more or less successful than someone, or more or less powerful, or more or less status. So my first step is just, wow, isn't that interesting that a number will do that so quickly? And then, as you say, if you're asking why is there a taboo talking about money, well, if naming figures or going in that area brings up all these different feelings, and I don't quite know why it brings up those feelings, and I'm not quite sure how to handle those feelings, then I'll make that a taboo. The obvious big other taboo in many areas of life is talking about sex, right? Well, again, it's very highly charged. It brings up a lot of feelings. We don't quite know, most people, how to handle those things. So rather than go, whoa, I suddenly talk about what I like in bed, and I'm bringing up all of this stuff about, am I okay in shame, and can I get what I want? All of this stuff comes up, right? We don't go, wow, that's a lot of stuff bundled up in sex. We just don't talk about it. I would say it's the same with money, that there's a tremendous amount of energy and emotion bundled up with money. And most people, rather than get interested about it, just don't like to talk about it.
But coming back to the point about sex, I think there's been numerous sort of like studies, and you read things where, even in conversations where people are comfortable talking with maybe a small group of friends, usually of the same gender, about sex, that would be far easier to talk about than money. So money's actually got, a rung up on the ladder in terms of the emotion and the power, and what's tied up with it. That problem of money is that it's actually, far more difficult than talking about sort of intimate pleasures, with strangers or friends. So that's quite well documented, which is fascinating in itself.
I would say that's true. For most people, I reckon not talking about money, but talking about me and money, and how I do money and how much money I have. Because we're happy to moan about, tax levels or house prices, or, we talk about money, but actually talking about how I do money and my figures and what it means to me is a big taboo. So part of the problem of money, I don't think that is the problem.
Yeah.
But part of the problem of money is whatever is going on that leads to us feeling constrained or whatever is tied up, I would say, with kind of strong emotion that normally we're not aware of. And then when there's any chance that, oh my God, I might have to deal with or experience that strong emotion, I'd rather not. So I sort of push it away. I mean, again, as you know, in the work, we do go into what's going on with that strong emotion, but I think that's not for today. So let me just give you one example, and maybe you're thinking of others. As I say, the obvious problem of money is I don't have enough. I'm struggling to pay my rent. That's definitely a problem that will dog us and will feel heavy, and that needs to be respected. But I think it is a mistake just to think if I then had a certain figure, the problem goes away. I'm thinking, in a group I work with, a guy who was a billionaire, as far as I know. And he was a very successful man, and he'd grown up in poverty. And one of his experiences is, because of the money he'd made, he found it very, very hard to really feel in relationship with his family and the people from, where he grew up. Okay. Because suddenly his numbers, his money was so radically different to how it had been. And somehow, and this isn't unusual, instead of going, well, actually, I've got the same relationships, I'm the same person, boom, 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 boom. It's just that I've got these huge numbers sitting in a computer somewhere. But, the relationships can stay the same, actually that was really, really hard. And there was so much complexity going on with those relationships. Do they understand me? Do they understand that my world now, when they relate to me, you know, is it because of money? It was like money, in this case, having lots of it, again, became this huge problem that very much got in the way of, or coming back to Jacob Needleman's quote, it was very hard for him to be free in those relationships. And that's not unusual at all. I've heard that story many times of people, particularly if they come from a certain, you know, kind of socioeconomic background, and then through money, they're kind of in another place. They can often really struggle with feelings of, do I still belong? Where do I belong? Who am I connected with? How do my relationships change? Yeah, so that's another example of the problem, is suddenly my numbers go up and my identity and my relationships start to feel quite wobbly.
And I guess what we're saying is that that's pretty much sort of self-inflicted in a way, because have things actually changed in the real world in terms of the relationships? Or is it just this, my number's gone up and now I'm thinking that, okay, people are, what's the motive of people now?
It's slightly both. So I would never say self-inflicted. I mean, I know what you mean, but I would never say self-inflicted. Yeah. What I would say is, in this whole, I would call it a money field, you know, in this kind of whole space of money where there's tangible things and numbers, but also a lot of emotion. And, you know, it's a very highly charged field. And that's why we often avoid it. I would say it's both, right? So my number changes, so maybe some of my own thoughts and feelings and judgments about myself change, or certain things come to the fore. But then you know what it's like, other people will relate to you differently. I will work with someone else doing quite well, you know, kind of senior level in a business, but not super wealthy by any stretch, and, you know, had children and trying to raise a family. He was doing fine. One of the things he realized is whenever he met business people or founders who were, quotes, more successful than him, you know, maybe they'd made more money with their businesses, he just suddenly noticed himself losing all his confidence and his power.
Even though he was successful.
Well, it's all relative, isn't it? But when he met someone who he perceived to have, if you like, bigger numbers, he suddenly lost his sense of power. So I think it's both. It's our own sense of ourself can change, but then other people do react differently.
Yeah. And it's funny, in my earlier days when I was advising clients, you know, if there was something about a client that came in with more than £1 million in sort of investable assets, I don't know why. Actually, it's funny. And I think, I don't know what exactly happens, but there's definitely a feeling that, am I qualified to deal with, you know, this person who's got £1 million? Whereas if someone had come in the day before with 999,000, it would have been, it would have been like, okay, yeah, that's fine. It was almost like there was this like boundary that, like, if I crossed it, I suddenly wouldn't know what I was doing, or I was ill-equipped, or I was less than. And it's just, when you sit down and you think about it, it's just totally ridiculous in a way to think that suddenly, you know, someone moves a pound and it's a number. And so much.
That's right. And suddenly you flip from feeling, let's say, competent and resourced, suddenly feeling maybe full of self-doubt, or not so confident, or a bit diminished. So again, this is something of the problem of money. It's not the problem with money. Money is not doing anything there, right? Money is just a number. Joe Bloggs has got 900,000. Bill Smith has got $1 million. The money's not a problem, but there's some entanglement with money where you go at some arbitrary number from being in touch, we would say, with this is your own inner capacity, from you feeling, yeah, I'm fine, I can do this, I'm good at this, to going, you know, it's like there's an internal shift based on a number. And you can sit there and tell me it doesn't make any sense. And yet, when it happens, it feels strong. And this is back to the quote. It feels like there's some force that suddenly puts you, as Jung would say, puts you into a complex. It's like stuff comes up, or some people would say you get triggered by a number, right? Yeah. So that's super interesting. Why does this number I still feel fine, and this number starts to freak me out?
Yeah.
It's the same with this guy I was telling you. You know, if he met someone at a cocktail party, he goes to some event, and he assesses this person is more or less at my level, or, you know, maybe doing slightly better, he can still be in touch with his own power and competence. And if he perceives this other guy, his numbers are very different, suddenly he collapses. And he's got no idea. This guy he might be meeting might be, you know, super happy or super unhappy, or have a great marriage or a terrible marriage, or be very lonely or very happy. Who the hell knows? It's nothing to do with the situation. What do these numbers trigger or bring up in me? And as long as I don't like to look at that, that's the problem of money, that money brings stuff up, but it's not money's fault.
Yeah. Money is neutral. I mean, that's what everything that I've read is, you know, money is neither good nor bad. It's just a tool. And yet, you know, there's so much baggage that comes along with money, whether it's too much or too little. There's always this tension around it, and it's really interesting. I kind of want to go into so why is all of this happening? So I guess at this stage so we've identified there's a problem. What could be some sort of like key little maybe takeaways or things that people that are listening, we know that there's a problem, and so what can the average person do about it?
Yeah, it's a good question. If we've got time, I would like to take the problem one step further and then come back to what we could do.
Okay, let's do that.
Because I think what we've talked about is sort of the problem, if you like, in the moment. You know, I meet someone and I think they've got more money than me, or I haven't got money. And, you know, again, we're not underestimating if I really can't heat my home or pay my bills. That's also a very real problem. We're just saying it's not the only problem or force of money, right? But if I take it a step further, because of what all of that means, I think in our lives, a place most of us find it really hard to be free is just to kind of do what we really want to do, right? You know, so I'll give examples on my workshops. I have all sorts of people who are doing work that they don't really want to do. If it wasn't for money, they wouldn't be doing that. They might be doing something quite different. Or sometimes people do like their work, but what they'd really like to be doing is more maybe some artistic stuff, or spiritual training, or yoga teaching, or traveling. So one of the most obvious ways that we're not free in relation to the force of money is when we think, and we're strongly socialized, all of us, to think this is like, well, you know, I can't do what I want. I'm not free to follow whatever it is I want, or whatever I most love about the world, or what I most believe. So on a deep level, and I think our whole education system does this, and our whole media, and we tell ourselves and we tell our children, but fundamentally there's a belief that one simply couldn't in life wake up and think, you know what, here I am, I've got one life, I am free to try and pursue or create or do whatever I really want to do. Most people don't experience their life that way, I believe. And what most people believe is, I'm not free, I need to somehow deal with this force of money. I need to somehow satisfy what's required with money. And only when I've done that could I possibly feel free or generous to kind of, you know, in life, to be in life. And so I think that's the fundamental problem of money, is that we have this very deep belief, all of us, that we're not really free until somehow the money is okay, whatever that means. And you know, that's a very real problem in many, many people's lives, because the number of people, you know, let's say at some point in their life, often in midlife, who kind of go, you know what, if they're lucky, I have money, I may not be super rich, but I'm earning money, maybe I have a home, I'm doing okay, but I don't feel free in my life. I feel constrained, I feel stuck, or I feel like I'm on the wrong track, heading in the direction that's not what I want. Now, that's a real problem, because many people live their whole lives heading in that direction. The money, let's say, is more or less okay. You know, there's a bit of savings now, a bit of a pension. I'm starting to pay off the house. I'm doing okay. But in their hearts and souls, they don't feel free. And then if they're not careful, they never get to really do or express or explore what on a deeper level they're really here to do. So I think that's the fundamental problem. And I think that's what Jacob Needleman's saying, is it exerts a pressure that is powerful and insistent. So I think most of us, that's about, well, I've got to get kind of, on the treadmill, or I've got to go on these, or I couldn't possibly shift, I couldn't possibly do something different. There's this insistent pressure. And I think that's really what draws a lot of people to this work, and something we should, talk about.
Yeah. So the one thing that was sort of just spinning around in my head when you were talking about this was, we're talking very general here, because there's obviously a spectrum of people. So, but this idea of not being free and the inability to pursue whatever we want to sort of term it in terms of, or just being free to live one's life according to the way that they want to. Are we talking about people here who have their basic needs met and are earning a sufficient amount of money that they're not worried about where their next meal is coming from? Because for them, I'm just thinking, well, this is sort of like a conversation which, that they literally are needing the problem of money for them is literally that they've not got enough to sustain just their basics. So that the higher level of, what could I be doing with my life if money weren't an object? Is that a difficult thing to sort of
So this is where it's tricky with our podcast, because we so quickly want to go deep, right? Yeah. And then you and I talk about, well, we want to do some introductory podcasts. Yeah. And then it's difficult, because if we do an introductory one in a relatively short time, it may sound, what I'm about to say may sound overly provocative or sort of, unfair or overly privileged. So, but what I want to say is, for now, consider that actually, although people's situations may be different, the fundamental idea that we are not free, we don't feel free as human beings to kind of follow the life that we really want. That is a pattern that I see in every type of person. I see it in people who are struggling to pay bills and get food, because obviously then you don't feel free. Yeah. Right? You think, geez, I've just got to get money and I don't even have enough of that. So then I don't feel free, right? And yet it's worth noting that there are some people in the world who are born with very little or struggle materially, and somehow, very unusually, but possible, somehow they still experience themselves as free to go off and do remarkable things. But absolutely most people, when they're struggling materially, you feel very constrained. But then you go up a bit, let's say, and a typical, maybe a professional person, I'm doing okay. I can heat my home. I have got a roof over my head. I can feed my family, right? Yeah. So very different situation. But most of those also, because they're full of insecurity about, well, what if I lost the job? Or what if the savings run out? Or what if someone got sick? Or maybe I'm doing fine, but I don't really feel free because I need to put my money into a pension. So although the outer form of my constraint looks very different and maybe much more comfortable,
it's still there.
The inner thing about, do you actually feel free, mate, to go and do what you really believe in your life? The answer is no. They'll both give you different reasons. Yeah. And they'll both have different, judgments of each other and themselves. But at the deep level, do you feel free? No. And yet sometimes, again, at that position too, some people go, sod it, maybe they have a real health scare and they wake up and they, blimey, I'm not here for long. I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to do something scary. I'm going to go and head in the direction I always dreamed of before life runs out. And often actually it is a shock or a scare that will shift people. And then, the final end of the scale, back to my example, maybe someone with more money than they could ever possibly use in their life, right? Crazy amount of money. And you think, well, they get to feel free. And guess what? When you talk to them, they often feel burdened with responsibility. They find it really tricky to be free in relationship to people because they're not quite sure, who they can really trust. If they have children, the money can be a terrible problem. Yeah. How do I parent? How do I support my children? I don't want them to lose the money. I don't want to control them. They can feel, people who've inherited family wealth from the previous generation got ridiculous amounts of money, but they often feel incredibly constrained. If I lose this family money, or I have to stay in the family business. So from the outer perspective, they look like totally different situations, right? And if I really thought money was the thing, I go, well, obviously these people aren't free because they can't pay their bills, and these people are free to do whatever the hell they like because they've got so many zeros. When you actually get into what it feels like, I can tell you, and you'll probably know from your work, each of these groups is perfectly capable of feeling very constrained and very weighed down and very not free in a way that feels very real for them, but it's different. And in each group, it is possible to find humans who, whatever their money situation, somehow live their lives, let's say, very courageously, with great trust and with a sense of freedom. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. And thank you for clearing that up, because it's so easy to get fixated on the outer, right?
That's what we do. That's what we all do, and we make judgments one way or the other of other people and how it must be for them, etc.
Yeah.
And you asked me about what could someone do. So I've got an example, but did you want to say anything else?
I think that's pretty good for us to look at a couple of practical takeaways of where can we go with this.
Well, let me offer two, and they're just steps, right? Two really nice little exercises that someone listening to this could do for the next week or two, and just see where they go. And since we've talked about this feeling of freedom from the quote, I'm going to stay with kind of being free. But actually, you could apply this to many different feelings that come with money. The first thing is about starting to be more curious about the everyday story we tell us. So if most people listening to this, I think, would assume, yeah, if I've got no money, there's no way I'm going to be free. I'm going to be constrained. And the more money I get, the more free I will feel, right? That's a fairly standard story. So the first thing I do is just start to notice what I call counter examples to your normal money story. So if I believe people with money always feel free and people without money don't get to feel free, and that is definitely true for some people, but probably I don't notice the opposites. So can I notice, maybe I read biographies or obituaries, or maybe I actually think about some of these Hollywood stars, or can you actually notice in the news or in history examples of people with loads of money who, if you actually look at it, probably felt very, very weighed down and constrained and not free? Just notice. Can you find any? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. And at the other, can you notice, people you know, or stories you've heard, or things you read in the news, or historical figures? Can you notice people who had very little money, but somehow were very free in life? So starting to just note it, almost like keep a little diary. And can I find examples with people with lots of money and no money where people got to be both free and constrained? And what you normally find if you start to do that is you start to go, oh yeah, it's not as straightforward as I thought. It's not all about the number. I can see examples of both kinds with all sorts of money. So that's a really good first step. And then the second thing I'd offer people, if they were really interested, now think about your own life. And you probably need to be have a few decades behind you to do this, but you can have a go. And if the thing, for now we're talking about is freedom, but you could also talk about security or fun, or you could talk about many things we think power go with money. But if we think about freedom, I would just say, just review your own life and come up with times where you really felt most free in your life. When did you just feel free? Like, I can do what I want. I'm going to go off and do something. I'm going to have a go or take a risk or follow my nose or whatever that means. And just note down maybe 2 or 3 times in your life where you really felt free. Yeah. And when you've done them, and you can always imagine yourself in them, and maybe even, if you're lucky, touch into that feeling of freedom again. Right. And then just ask yourself, yeah, and how was money for me at that point? So go for the feeling first, freedom, and then think, yeah, did I have money? Did I not have money? And also do the opposite. You could think, when did I feel constrained or maybe a bit weighed down or trapped in my life? And think about your money then. Again, very often, people of a certain age will go, God, actually, when I was younger, I remember being a student, or I remember in my 20s or something, and I felt free and I just went off and did this, or I left this job, or I went traveling, or whatever it was. And they realized I was really free. And you say, oh yeah, well, did you have lots of money? No, I didn't have any money. Often they'll say that. And then when did you feel constrained in your life? And they'll say, well, I feel constrained at this point and that point. Actually, you know, when I bought my first house, or when I'm earning this much money. So that's another way of starting to actually investigate the reality of the feeling of freedom and the feeling of constraint. And is it as connected with a number as we like to think? So there would be two great pieces of homework. If anyone does do this and listens to this, you know, it'd be great. Let us know what you come up with. And that, as you know, Shabbar, that's just a first step, just to start to interrogate our everyday story about these things.
I'm certainly going to sit down and do those myself, because I love investigating my relationship with money and uncovering, you know, some of the what should we call them? Some of the gremlins, or the misunderstood parts of my own relationship. So I think that's a good place to finish today. And I'll see you next time.
Look forward to more. Cheers.